Hey, thanks, and hello, everyone. My name is Max Veit. I am also a postdoc in the Cosmo Laboratory of Professor Michele Ceriotti at EPFL, and I've been working for the past few months with Lorenzo on this project of building an integrated machine learning framework to model the properties of ferroelectric materials, specifically barium titanate. So as Lorenzo just showed you, we built a machine learning potential to model the thermodynamics and compute phase transition properties of barium titanate. So we can compute with this model not only the phase transition temperatures, but also get a detailed microscopic insight into the phase transition mechanisms. So this is very useful, but there are many other properties that barium titanate has that make it useful for technological applications. For instance, it's very high dielectric constant. And so we'd like to be able to model those sorts of things with our model as well. And in order to do that, we need to augment our machine learning potential energy surface with a machine learning polarization surface or dipole moment surface. So how do we do that? Well, if you saw my APS talk from last year, you saw how we can use the symmetry adapted Gaussian process regression framework, SAGPR, to fit the dipole moment of molecules. All right, so since the dipole moment is a vector quantity, we need a tensorial extension of the same SOAP framework that we use to fit the potential energy surface. Right, and so in the condensed phase, we can do the same thing because the polarization is just dipole per unit volume. And so we do this, we take the total supercell dipole and decompose it among all the atomic centers. And then we fit the sum of these things to DFT data. All right, so at this point, I think many of you will be objecting, no, wait a minute, you can't do this. Right? I mean, these quantities, the dipole moment, the polarization, they're not actually well defined in condensed phase. And you'd be right in the sense that in the modern theory of polarization, right, the polarization in condensed phase systems where we're using periodic boundary conditions is no longer a single valued function of the geometry. And I think this is best illustrated with this one-dimensional chain of alternating charges here. Right? Depending on how you pick the unit cell, if we pick the one on the left, the polarization points this way. If we pick the one on the right, it points in exactly the opposite direction. So in general, we find that the polarization takes the form of a lattice. So it's only unique modulo a number we call the polarization quantum. Now, it seemed this would really throw a spanner in the works and not let us fit a machine learning model to this function because, well, it's not a function, right? It's a multi-valued object. But it turns out we have a way around that. So if we find a proxy polarization that very smoothly with the atomic positions and is a single valued function, we can plot that against the baryphase polarization we get from DFT, and we see it very neatly separate into these different branches that we can then all fold onto one, which we can do because they're all equivalent, and get this nice single valued function that we can fit with our machine learning model. All right, so with that difficulty addressed, I'd like to get back to this idea of decomposing the polarization into these atomic contributions. Now, this is actually very useful because it gives us a spatially resolved picture of how the polarization is distributed through the material, right? And we can use this, for instance, to distinguish the phases, as Lorenzo has already showed you, right? So you see this figure of the unit cell histograms across the 4 different phases, right? So the unit cell polarization histograms. So in the cubic phase, the unit cell polarization visits all 8 corners of a cube, more or less symmetrically. But as we go into the tetragonal phase, that symmetry is broken and the pattern shifts and distorts, and so on for the other 2 phase transitions, right? And we can do this because we have access to this unit cell polarization from the spatially resolved decomposition. And now another thing we can do with the spatially resolved polarizations is to look at how they correlate across the structure, right? So if you look at, for instance, the correlation coefficient of 2 unit cell polarizations at 2 different titanium centers here, and we look at how those vary across a structure, we see that these correlations extend all the way to the edges of a 5x5x5 supercell, even though our model itself is explicitly short-ranged. Right? So you see that it only explicitly includes interactions within this the cutoff sphere, so this blue circle here, and so everything beyond that is an emergent correlation, right? So this is very interesting because we're getting the qualitatively correct physics from an explicitly short-range model. And there's additional evidence that we have that this physics is qualitatively correct, namely the directionality of these correlations, right? So you see the x component only correlates along the x direction, only correlates along the x direction, Right? And so this is something that's been found previously in experiments going back all the way back to the 60s, and more recently in simulations where they call them needle-like correlations. Right? So we're getting qualitatively the correct physics from an explicitly short-range model. Now, I started this presentation by saying I would talk about calculating the dielectric constant, and so here's how we do that. We use this formula that we derived from linear response theory. Well, we didn't derive it, but it's fairly well known actually. And it only works in the cubic phase, but all we need is the supercell dipole over the course of an MD trajectory, right? And so we just calculate the fluctuations of the magnitude of the supercell dipole, and we can calculate the dielectric constant. And so if we look at it here as a function of temperature, we see that it follows the Curie-Weiss law, which predicts how response properties like the dielectric constant behave above transition critical temperatures, in this case, the cubic to tetragonal transition. All right, and so we see here that the fit is actually quite good. The only problem is that the critical temperature is actually quite a bit lower than the phase transition temperature predicted by the thermodynamic simulations that Lorenzo showed you, right? So it turns out that this is just a finite size effect, right? We use large enough supercells, we converge to the right critical temperature, and our dielectric constants follow Curie-Weiss law. Only actual problem remaining is that the constant that we predict for this law is about twice as small as experiment predicts it to be, or shows it to be. So that's another one of these annoying discrepancies between our model's predictions and experiments that we have to resolve. And so to look a little bit deeper into this discrepancy, we decided to calculate not only the static dielectric constant, but the full frequency-dependent dielectric response spectrum. And in fact, we can do this using the same linear response theory as before. It gives us this formula, which is essentially the Fourier transform of the dipole-dipole autocorrelation function, and we get a response spectrum like the one here. And so at the zero frequency limit, this is the static dielectric constant, and the whole frequency-dependent thing looks like a harmonic oscillator response function, actually. So you see, especially this, this resonance peak in the imaginary part of the spectrum, right? And so if we fit this to a simple harmonic oscillator response function, we get sort of okay agreement, but in fact, we get the best agreement if we fit it to two harmonic oscillators, right? So, this is actually something that was already discovered by a combined experimental theoretical study that on barium titanate that showed that you do indeed need two oscillators to describe the dielectric response of barium titanate. And so this is another instance of a model reproducing qualitatively correct physics. But of course, quantitatively, well, our frequencies are too high. And so at this point, we wondered, well, maybe this is connected to this negative pressure, or this effective pressure effect that Lorenzo already showed you, right? So to recap, right, the DFT underestimates the lattice constants by a little bit, but this has a very large effect on the phase transition temperatures that we predict. And so what if we took those negative pressure simulations that Lorenzo showed you and see what the dielectric response spectrum for those looks like? And here are the results. And it turns out that for the same temperatures, indeed, we do see the peaks shifting to lower values towards experiment. So this is a very compelling piece of evidence that a large part of our disagreements with experiment could stem from, fundamentally this DFT underestimation of the lattice parameter. All right, so to wrap up, we've shown, Lorenzo and I have shown an integrated machine learning framework that can give us a comprehensive physical insight into a prototypical ferroelectric material, in this case, barium titanate. It is automated, accurate to the DFT reference we provide it, systematically improvable, and altogether it means it's extensible to different types of ferroelectric materials that may not share the same well-studied ferroelectric mechanism as barium titanate. If the framework we can use it to compute thermodynamic and finite temperature response properties, not yet with experimental quantitative accuracy, but it does give us the mechanisms to investigate these discrepancies and find out, why they're happening in the first place, right? And we've discovered, one of the possible culprits is this effective pressure coming from the DFT underestimation of the lattice parameter. So in the future, we'd like to improve the efficiency of a model so we can tackle larger cell sizes, supercell sizes. We've seen how important that can be. And also on the physics side of things, add explicit long-range electrostatic interactions. Right? So you could either use we could either use an existing electrostatic model, or we could use a newer data-driven approach that was recently developed in our lab. Another thing we'd be interested in doing is coupling the polarization model directly into the Hamiltonian so that we can study things like finite field effects and also the dielectric response in phases other than the cubic ones. All right, so that's all I have. I'd like to thank, of course, everyone in the Cosmo group, especially my project partner, Lorenzo, my supervisor, Michele, and Federico for some very nice and useful discussions, all of our collaborators in the Theos group, also at EPFL, and our funders who you see here, and of course you for listening. And if you want to check out more about our work, it's up in the archive now, hopefully appearing very soon. But if you want to read about it now, you can scan that QR code and download the paper. And normally at this point, I'd be taking questions live, but apparently having me present live remotely is beyond the technological capabilities of the conference organization. So, well, there you go. I mean, you can send your questions to me asynchronously. I'll respond to them on Twitter or in the conference Q&A, and or you can just ask Lorenzo since he's there. So thank you very much.